It's great to have you for the last month's podcast for the 2019-2020 season of the Digging Deep Men's Bible Study. We're thankful for the participation of everyone, and especially today we're glad to have Ben with us for the podcast.
Great to be here. I'm excited to study Matthew 7 with you.
We're going to cover the last 5 verses 24 through 28, today as we think about the wise man and the foolish man. But before we get to our material, I would like for us to reveal the subject matter for the 2020-2021 year, and you should be able to see a graphic behind me shortly with a little advertisement for it, and it's called the 10 Commandments, holy, just, good, Romans chapter 7 and verse 12. So we're going to be taking 12 months to study 10 commandments, and we'll take a whole month on each of the commandments, and then we will take 2 months before we actually get into the 10, in which we'll talk about the significance of the 10 Commandments first in the Old Testament. That'll be the month of September. And then the significance of the 10 Commandments in the New Testament. That'll be October. And so we're excited to be launching onto this new study. We'll be releasing the study notes later today. Actually, we're taping this on August 31st, and trust this will be posted later today, and we will have the notes for you uploaded to calebcolley.com/digging deep, and we will give you a link to that on the Facebook group in case you don't remember the web address. So all of that is launching, and we will continue to bring you these podcasts each month in a similar format to what we've been doing this year, and Ben will be joining us over the phone as we do these podcasts together. We would like to do podcasts in person, but we live so far apart, and when we do have a chance to get together, we're doing so many different things, as you can imagine, with families and the activities we do together, that we just don't really have time to do a podcast in person. So it's a lot easier for us to do these when we're over the phone. But Ben, what do you look forward to about our study on the 10 Commandments in particular?
I look forward to 2 things. I look forward to better appreciating the difference in the dispensations that under which man has always operated. But I also look forward to better appreciating the new covenant, why it is so much better. So I want to see the timelessness of God's ethics and his morality that he's demanded from his creation since day one, but also understanding what the 10 Commandments are ultimately pointing us to.
Right. As we study each of these commandments, we think about what God expects of us in the New Testament age and how his ethical standards have always been the same. We just have a heightened standard in relation to those because of the coming of Christ. And we have a better law and a better covenant, but the basic ethical principles have never changed, have they?
Right. They've always been the same.
So we look forward to that, and if you have any questions about it, or if you are wanting to express a desire for the study to go one way or another on some particular topic, and you want to talk to us about how we can meet your needs for your particular context, if that's a class or a ministry setting or however you're using the material, and you would like for us to do something in particular to make it more fruitful for you, then please don't hesitate to reach out to either of us so we can modify our notes or do something to help. Let's read, I guess, if you're ready, Ben, the verses that are under consideration today, Matthew 7, beginning in verse 24. I'll just read the text, and then we'll begin making some comments. Therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and acts on them may be compared to a wise man who built his house on the rock. And the rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and slammed against that house. And yet it did not fall, for it had been founded on the rock. Everyone who hears these words of mine and does not act on them will be like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. The rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and slammed against that house, and it fell, and great was its fall. When Jesus had finished these words, the crowds were amazed at his teaching, for he was teaching them as one having authority and not as the scribes. That's actually 6 verses through verse 29. I miscounted, but we do have 6, and we can learn a lot from each verse. we had a helpful comment from James Weaver who pointed out that Jesus could have been using this illustration about the wise man and the foolish man as a reflection on his days as a carpenter. We remember from Mark 6 and verse 3 that Jesus had worked as a carpenter, and so it's certainly true that Jesus might have been remembering some of that, although the text doesn't say. Regardless, he was certainly using a familiar illustration. Even if you're not a carpenter, you can still understand the need for building on a good foundation. Although I heard recently that the top 10 considerations for first-time home buyers is a list of things ranging from updated kitchens and bathrooms and the perhaps flooring in the house, things like that, but not the foundation. Nobody's really as much concerned about the foundation. In a sense, that may show a lack of maturity about choosing your house, but then on the other hand, it may be that you just expect that the inspection is going to evaluate the foundation. And if you were to find out, even if you don't think a lot about the foundation when you're going to pick a house, if the inspection came back and said it's a little bit questionable, then you would probably either not buy the house or you would make sure that got rectified before you bought it, because everybody knows that a foundation is a very important thing. You don't want to build on a sinkhole, do you?
No, foundations are very expensive to fix. You know, you and I have both shopped for houses in our adulthood now, and one of the things I've learned to look for when shopping for a house is notice the cracks in the wall, notice the hairline cracks, see if there's any stretch marks in those cracks with the drywall, because those marks often betray foundation problems.
So let's think about 1 Corinthians 3, 14 and 15, because another comment that we've received asked us to compare Matthew 7, 24 and 25 with this passage where Paul also talks about foundations and building materials. And I'll just read this text, and I want to set it up by saying that Paul is talking about the conversion of the Corinthians, where Apollos watered and God gave the increase. And if we look down at chapter 3 and verse 6, Paul planted, Apollos watered, God gave the increase. So we're talking about the building up of the church, and the church specifically at Corinth. And that's the construction that we're thinking about. But 1 Corinthians 3, beginning in verse 10 says, "According to the grace of God which was given to me, like a wise master builder, I laid a foundation, and another is building on it. But each man must be careful how he builds on it. For no man can lay a foundation other than the one which is laid, which is Jesus Christ. Now if any man builds on the foundation with gold, silver, precious stones, wood, hay, straw, each man's work will become evident. For the day will show it, because it is to be revealed with fire. And the fire itself will test the quality of each man's work. If any man's work which he has built on it remains, he will receive a reward. If any man's work is burned up, he will suffer loss, but he himself will be saved, yet so as through fire." Well, Ben, obviously there's a similarity here in that we're talking about a building that does survive versus a building that doesn't survive, and there is a spiritual quality about the building materials in the house that does survive, and a spiritual failing on the part of the building that doesn't survive. But the foundation for both the one that survives and the one that doesn't survive is Christ. And so it seems to me that in 1 Corinthians 3, we're really talking about Paul's converts and whether they will remain faithful. He's given all of the people he's taught the same foundation of an understanding of Jesus Christ, and they've obeyed the gospel. So the question is, will they remain faithful? And Paul, as the builder, is going to suffer loss if some of them do not remain faithful. It's going to be a tragedy for him, but he'll still be saved. Notice at the end it says, he himself will be saved, even if his work is burned up, yet so is through fire. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that does make sense. Now, Caleb, correct me if I'm wrong, but the emphasis in verse 12, if anyone builds on the foundation with gold, silver, precious stones, wood, hay, straw, that's in reference to the preacher at the time, right? Not necessarily the individual, because the discussion in that context is you have Apollos, you have Paul, and
they're the builders.
Maybe even Cephas had some influence there, and what you find is they're the builders, and it is a reminder that when we're converting people, when we're teaching people, we need to take great care that we're building on the foundation with proper quality. We're not just haphazardly, pointing people where they need to go, because if we don't help them build, foster their own faith, then the moment adversity comes, they're going to realize that their faith was just built on whatever we said, rather than them really understanding what they actually believe.
That's right. So the quality of our building is what's at issue. And of course, some of the quality of the building material has to do with the heart of the person who's being taught. There are both aspects: the quality of the building in terms of the teaching that's going on, and the quality of the building in terms of the one who is taught, or the student's heart. And
Right.
both of them have to be good in order for the
Right.
outcome to be what it needs to be. So we want to make sure we're building well. So I guess by summary, we would say, yes, there's a similarity between 1 Corinthians 3 and Matthew 7 on this point, but the illustrations are somewhat different.
Right.
Okay, but now having considered that other passage in 1 Corinthians, let's think about Matthew 7 and the metaphors that Jesus is using about the two different kinds of foundation. Whereas in 1 Corinthians 3, the foundation is Christ, whether we're talking about the building that succeeds or the building that doesn't. Here, in Matthew 7, with a different illustration, one foundation is good, one foundation is bad. So, Ben, what do these two foundations represent?
Well, they reflect your philosophy of life. Where you've really anchored your soul, what you're building on. Are you building your life on your feelings, your intuition, your own pragmatism, your own career, your own desires, your own theories, or are you building your life on Jesus Christ, who is truth, who is sent into the world to reveal the truth of God? What are you building your life on?
The word that's translated rock, when we think about the foundation on which the wise man built, is Petra, and it refers to a boulder. It's not like a pebble. It's a mass of rock on which somebody could build so that he could have a firm foundation, something that's not going to be shaken. And Jesus' tomb was hewn out of this kind of a rock in Mark 15:46. And so you can imagine the houses could have been built on top of the hill where Jesus' tomb was carved into that hill. And this is the concept that is so often brought up in the Old Testament. And I think I had the students look for passages where rock was used this way in the Old Testament to talk about God as the foundation of life, that there is no rock like our God. I noted Psalms 18:2, verse 31, same chapter, Psalm 18, verse 46, same chapter, Psalm 18, and then Psalm 62:2, Psalm 62:6, Psalm 62:7. I noted, and you may have other passages to bring up, I noted Deuteronomy 32, verses 30 and 31, which says, "How could one chase 1,000 and two put 10,000 to flight unless their rock had sold them?" That is, false gods or bad leaders. They were depending on a faulty foundation. Their rock sold them, and the Lord had given them up. Indeed, their rock is not like our rock. Even our enemies themselves judge this. Or 1 Samuel 2:2 says, "There is no one holy like the Lord. Indeed, there is no one besides you, nor is there any rock like our God." So here are passages that use the same idea that Jesus is using. And maybe when Jesus starts talking about foundations and building upon the rock, the wise man built his house on the rock, these people were thinking about many Old Testament passages that referred to God as a rock, that is a dependable foundation for our lives.
Right. Well, you have, there's several passages that refer to Jesus Christ as the rock. And so I don't know, maybe that's kind of cheating on this particular assignment, but I just pointed to those passages. 1 Corinthians chapter 10.
Right.
The rock was there following the Israelites around. That excuse me. That rock was protecting, defending. That rock was sustaining the Israelites all along. You have Romans chapter 9, verse 33, the rock of offense. What people find the God of the New Testament and the principles of the New Testament a great stumbling block, and the Jesus Christ of prophecy a great stumbling block. Now, let's see. There was one more that I just thought of just now, where you have. Let's see here. We have Psalm 46. The mountains, they're being moved, but of course those mountains are not in reference to God or Jesus Christ. Those mountains are the things in life that we think would never change, the things in life that we think are permanent in our lives. But even those things are going to be moved in life if they are not Jesus Christ, who is the same yesterday, today, and forever. Other things that we think would never change, loved ones, our own faculties, our own abilities, our own health, whatever it is, those mountains are going to be moved, those rocks.
Right. In that same passage, I thought that was a good one to bring up, Psalm 46:5, talking about the city of God. God is in the midst of her. She will not be moved. And, of course, when we think about the city of God as the church in Hebrews 12:22 and following, then we understand that nothing can cause the church to be destroyed. And you have a rock illustration again in Daniel 2:44 about the church as a little rock that comes out of the mountain and destroys the big image that's in the dream of Nebuchadnezzar. And we could go on with that, but that's a very potent biblical image that comes up again and again of God as the rock of salvation and the one on whom we can depend. Well, before we talk about the foolish man's foundation, why don't we think for a moment about the storm? And what does the storm represent? I think we said in the notes that because it involves the toppling of the person's house, and if the house represents our overall lives, which it certainly seems to, our moral life before God, because we're building on the foundation of obedience to Him in our lives, and that house falls, it seems to me that the storm could involve everything, including death. It could be not just the troubles of life, but the fact that ultimately we're all going to die. And so what will be the end of us at that point? So that's the culmination of all the storms of life, in a sense, is that life is fragile and temporary, and the Bible teaches in so many passages that all of us will die. So the question is, what will be the result of everything that happens to us, including our own death? What will be the end of all that? Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. What's interesting, though, is, and I don't know, maybe I'm missing the question that you just asked me, but I'm just, did you ask a specific question before I launch into this?
Not necessarily. Okay. Go ahead. Go ahead. I was just thinking out loud. Sometimes I just talk.
Today, very seldom do storms come upon us without warning. I mean, today, because of technology, we have pretty early warning. It's amazing the storm. Let's see, was it Laura that most recently hit the Gulf Coast? The model was so accurate, just like 48 hours in advance. They knew within a mile exactly where that storm was going to be. It's amazing, and those people were able to prepare. And if you live on the Gulf, you would be very foolish to not build your house to code, because there's going to come a time when that storm is going to come. So you're gonna follow all the right precautions in building your house. And here, what Jesus is doing is He's giving us this early warning system. The storms of life are going to come. Do you have a faith that can sustain you at that time? When you're diagnosed with that cancer diagnosis, when your spouse dies, when your child dies, I mean, whatever it is, do you have a view of God? Is your life built on the right foundation to sustain you at that time?
Right, and 1 Peter 3:12 says that if we are living for the world, if we're wicked, then the eyes of the Lord are against us. if we're doing evil, and his face is not turned toward us so that he will hear us when we pray. And so there has to be a faithful life that will put us in a position where we can appeal to God in some of those testing moments of life so that we'll be able to endure it. So here are the trials of life pictured as a storm that slams against us, and the imagery is really vivid about will we be able to take it, and we can only take it if we're grounded in God. So really the strength of the person who is able to take the storm is not in himself, it's in that foundation. If you're anchored to that foundation, then you're okay, but if you're not, then you're going to get washed away.
Right, absolutely. Can I go on just a little bit of a tangent
Sure.
right now? Because talking about this, I can't help but remember a part of my childhood. Growing up in Cincinnati, every time we would drive to church, we'd pass the University of Cincinnati, which was the state university,
Right.
and part of the state university system. And there was every time we passed that university, I remember seeing the Arnoff Center for Design. It was the art building.
Yeah.
And what was interesting about this Arnoff Center for Design is it was famous for its deconstructivist architecture. You know, you've seen these, right? You've seen these pictures of these buildings that are, you have staircases coming out of nowhere. You have windows that are just very, they're proportioned differently, walls just ending abruptly. Walking into a building like this, you just kind of, you have to fight this sense of vertigo sometimes because
Wow.
everything is just kind of ridiculous. And there are other buildings like that. Just I remember as a child seeing this Arnoff Center for Design. And, what is not off about that building is the foundation. They weren't about to build that building without having the proper foundation.
I'm looking up pictures so I can see what it looks like. Yes.
The
Wow.
idea behind any kind of deconstructivist architecture is to mock order, to mock symmetry, to mock the typical rules of design and stability of architecture. But of course, you can't afford to do that with the foundation. The foundation is just going to be a normal foundation. And it's interesting how no one tries to touch the foundation.
Right.
You're gonna go with what works. Otherwise, it doesn't matter how you build the rest of the building. It's just going to fall down.
And you've got to, as you said a moment ago, you have to build it to code. And that would speak to in spiritual terms, that would speak to following the pattern that the divine designer has built. And even Hebrews 3:4 says that every house is built by some man, but he who built all things is God. And so God is the architect of the world, and he's the one in a position to give us the proper foundation for our lives. And except the Lord build the house, they labor in vain who build it. And that would be true of the family, but it's also true of our whole lives individually.
Right. Think about Jesus' point here in Matthew 7. He's not talking about the appearance of the buildings at all. In fact, the house that was destined to fall, it very much could have been much more impressive, much more beautiful than the house that was going to be able to withstand the storm. This is purely about the foundation, because the foundation is what's going to make or break the structure itself.
And we think about a lot of people who are very impressive in one way or another, whose lives aren't built on the rock. And we need to pity those people rather than wishing we could be like them, because they're not in a position to have ultimate success. And whether it be that they have a lot more money than we do, or more prestige, or they have some degree that we don't have, or that they have some recognition among men that we don't have, those things may be fine in and of themselves, but if their lives aren't built on the rock, then they're to actually be pitied.
Right, absolutely.
So the externals are not under consideration here. The beauty of the house, or how fine it may be thought of in the world, but really what's at the heart of a person's life and what are his priorities. When we think about the word wisdom here, it says it's the wise man who built his house on the rock. very often people think of wisdom as being something else than what the Bible teaches. And true wisdom is learning to think like Jesus and to bring every thought captive to Christ. True wisdom is not following the trends of thought that are popular in this world, or following pop psychology, or following the particular thought of a given philosopher or something like that, but learning God's wisdom, or what's called the wisdom from above in James 3:13 and following, or learning the wisdom of the cross, which is to men who are perishing foolishness in 1 Corinthians 1 and 2, or Colossians 2:1-5, and other passages that discuss what God's conception of wisdom is. I might just ask you to comment for a moment on what biblical ideas come to your mind when you think about who a wise man is. Here he's considered the one who builds his house on a rock, and the Bible would phrase that or picture that in different ways, in different passages. But if you were going to open your Bible with someone and say, here's what a wise person is like, which passage in the Bible or passages would you consider?
Well, I mean, take your pick. The Bible is full of countless examples of people relying on their own pragmatism, them taking their direction of life just following what they think is best. So we could come up with a long list of people that wanted to worship God the way they wanted to worship God, but it didn't end up well for them because they didn't follow God's pattern. You think about God's instructions throughout the Old Testament on how to build the tabernacle and later the temple. It had to be directly out of the pattern. You couldn't deviate from that. You think about when David was moving the Ark of the Covenant, and you think about how that went. True intelligence is ironically not about relying on your own wisdom. It's about simply taking God at his word, getting as close to his will as possible. In fact, when we realize that God is most glorified when we're most interested in doing things his way, then that's actually the essence of true wisdom right now. What that means is some of the most simple people that you've ever met in the world are at times, because of their faithful dependence upon God and their faithful obedience to him, they're sometimes the most wise among us.
That's right. And obviously there are people who are accomplished in various ways, and we don't want to denigrate what they've done, but if they're missing what Jesus is teaching here, then they're just not wise. They've made a foolish mistake, or they've counted something as being valuable that's really not valuable. Think about the house for a moment, and someone who does everything he can to decorate the house to look a certain way, but if he's not paid attention to the fundamentals of the house, then he's destined for heartbreak and tragedy with his house. The foolish man shows us a picture of failure to prepare for the storms. And I asked the question in the study, can we think of other parables that Jesus taught that teach the principle of preparation, that it's crucially important to be prepared? And I made a list of 8 of these in addition to the parable we're considering today, or the comparison we're considering today. But we've got the parable of the tenants in Matthew 21:33-45, the parable of the wedding banquet in Matthew 22:2-14, the parable of the 10 virgins, Matthew 25:1-13, parable of the talents, obviously, in chapter 25, verses 14-30, and similarly, the parable of the 10 minas in Luke 19:11-27, the growing seed in Mark 4:26-29, the absent householder, Mark 13:34-37, the watchful servants in Luke 12:35-40, and the faithful servant in Matthew 24:45-51, which is also in Luke 12:42-48. So there are the parables. I know I just ran through those, but I want us to be impressed with the idea that Jesus taught a lot of parables about looking to the future and thinking about what may happen.
Oh, yes.
And in fact, in many cases, what is certain to happen. And most of these have something to do with the judgment day, that we need to be thinking about the fact that this life is just a preparation for that day. And so what we might do, we don't have time to go over this in class, but I would urge our diggers to go through each of these parables that we've mentioned and make a little summary of what this parable says about being prepared. And I believe that's actually part of the assignment. So many of you have already done this, given that this is August 31st already. You've probably already been through it and made a summary of what these parables teach about preparation. But the Bible is so full of information about the need to be ready for what will come. And there are a bunch of proverbs about this. James writes about this. There are other passages that do. But I might ask for your comment, Ben, on the need to be prepared really for the daily things that come to us in life and then ultimately for the judgment day.
Well, I don't know. I can't. I don't know if I can add anything too much more special than you. It is important that we live in view of eternity always. In fact, Jesus keeps coming back to the judgment day in his teaching. The only item that wasn't on your list that was on my list, I think, was Matthew 13, where you have the parable of the weeds, and you have the gathering of the wheat at harvest and separating that from that which is no good. But of course, that's not necessarily about preparation, except in view of the fact that there's going to come a gathering.
Right.
Are we building our life on the fact that there's going to be a gathering? And of course, Matthew 25, all those parables in that section, in that chapter, are all about the preparation, making sure that we are prepared. But of course, making sure that we are prepared for the day to day, making sure that we are prepared. Of course, we need to make sure that we're like David, and everything that we read in Psalm 119. We're just so aware of God's word that we're so, our mind is so saturated in God's word that we start thinking in terms of God's word, and it's so familiar to us that we just can't get that out of our head. And that, I mean, how else are we going to be prepared than that way?
The Bible talks about God's design of this world not as a hedonistic paradise where everything goes easily for us, but an arena where there are challenges and there are trials, and those smaller trials that come up in life should teach us this principle of preparation. There have been many times when something happened to me where I thought to myself, boy, I wasn't ready for that. I didn't know how to handle this. And I wished I had thought more about certain principles ahead of time. And those little ones, relatively little, I know there are big problems in life, but relatively small surprises that come up where we're shocked that we weren't better prepared, ought to lead us to think about, am I, in my whole life, am I living with a view toward death? Am I living with a view toward preparation for that day? And all that means really is, am I being a faithful Christian? But we need to be reminded that this life is not all there is, and it's appointed to man once to die, and after that the judgment, and as in Adam all die, 1 Corinthians 15:22, and live, not in a morbid way, but live in view of death, and recognize that I could spend my whole life trying to make my house look pretty, but I really need to be making sure that my house is stable and ready for the day of judgment,
Absolutely.
getting it in order.
I was just thinking about just a couple of people that Hannah and I know that are not Christians. They've never been Christians. They don't pretend to be Christians. And right now during COVID, it's interesting watching some of these people respond to COVID, because some of these people that they've never obeyed the gospel. They are not religious. They're secular people, and they have responded to this virus by completely shutting themselves off from everything and making sure that they don't take any risks at all. Why? Well, because if they die, they lose everything that they've ever built, everything that they're living for. Because they're not ready for death. They're terrified of death. And the virus is going to take everything from them if they were to die. And so, I mean, think about the difference between a Christian prepared to die, ready to die, not particularly afraid of death. I mean, there's some unknowns that we're nervous about, but just being prepared to stand before our Creator. I mean, it's a night and day difference. We don't go around just terrified of death.
For the Christian, to live as Christ and to die as gain, not to die as to lose everything. And
Right.
so we think about it differently. That's certainly true. I asked the diggers, or maybe you did. I'm struggling to remember who actually wrote this lesson because it's been a while since we wrote it. But I asked the diggers to think about 3 practical steps we can take to teach our children or our grandchildren the discipline to prepare for everyday life, because preparing for the little things will prepare us better to take care of the big things that come up. And I wrote down being a self-starter. That teaches you preparation for daily work, setting your alarm to get up in the morning, or learning to, keep your room clean, or whatever it is. Little disciplines that you can get in, or routines that you can get in, so that you make sure that your clothes are ready for the day. I mean, I want my kids to learn how to be prepared for daily life. And then also helping them learn to save money, not because we want to lay up treasures on earth, but learning that if we spend it all today, we won't have any tomorrow, but rather to put some aside so that we'll be ready. And then also helping them learn to keep a calendar so that they know, hey, a deadline is coming up. I need to have my assignment done by this date, or I need to have this job around the house done by a certain date, so that they can learn to look toward the future with the attitude of, I need to do something today for my future self, so that there will be something for me that's better in the future because of what I did today. If they can learn to think like that, then one day they can say to themselves, if I want to be a stronger Christian 5 or 10 years from now, there's something I need to start doing today to make that a reality. Whereas a lot of people go through their lives, even members of the church go through their lives never setting any goals for themselves. And so there's sort of an aimlessness in their spirituality where they don't grow the way they could if they sat down and asked themselves, where do I want to be in this amount of time? Or what do I want to know? Or what do I want to have accomplished for the Lord in this certain amount of time? If we learn to be disciplined enough to take necessary steps to get there, then I think we'll do more than we would otherwise.
Right. As I was making my list, I was thinking about different passages in the Bible that actually talk about foundations, and I maybe I'm a little bit of an overachiever, but I wrote down 6 things that I can teach my children,
Yeah,
and
good.
one day when I have grandchildren. Of course, the first passage would be what we've already mentioned at the beginning of our class. Of our podcast, 1 Corinthians chapter 3. That would be a foundation that's stamped Jesus Christ. They're going to be prepared for whatever comes their way if they have a foundation that is built on Jesus Christ. I'm going to instill that in my children. Jesus Christ is who you need to build your life on. Nothing else matters about you more than your relationship with Jesus Christ. I also wrote down Psalm 89, verse 14. Where it says righteousness and justice are the foundation of your throne. Anyway, I want my children to be prepared for the future by having a foundation in their life that's built on genuineness. They believe in justice. They believe in doing what is right, and they're ethical. I want their foundation to be that. Psalm 11. Verse 1, in the Lord I take refuge. Verse 3, if the foundations are destroyed, what can the righteous do? I'm going to teach my children to have a defended foundation. And while other people are running for cover and hiding, David's response is to take refuge in the Lord. And I want my children to know that Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever. Nothing can defeat you if you're on the Lord's side. Very quickly, Job 38, verse 4. Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. When I read that verse, I'm humbled. And so I want to teach humility to my children. I want them to be humbled. Hebrews chapter 6. Let us leave the elementary doctrines of the Lord, not laying again a foundation of repentance.
That's great. I
There's
love
that word.
this.
We're
I love
familiar
this.
with that. And so what I want to do is I want to build in my children a foundation that expects growth. I want them to want to grow, to want to have a better understanding of God's word, and to not be complacent. As if you're always growing, you're never going to be drifting, as Hebrews chapter 2, verse 1 warns. And lastly, you have Luke chapter 11, verses 49 through 50, where you read about, Jesus says, so that the blood of all the prophets shed from the foundation of the world may be
Yep.
charged against this generation. Anyway, you can. We don't have time to look at that passage, but I want to give my children a foundation that can withstand all kinds of criticism and persecution and ridicule, because they are secure in their knowledge that Jesus is the only thing that really matters in their walk with the Lord. And they can withstand anything if they understand that Jesus is who they are.
Good. Well, that's a great list and wonderful passages for them to incorporate into their lives and to memorize and to think about. We just have very little time left, but I'd like to conclude by looking at this question we asked the readers, or the diggers, to consider at the end about Jesus and the Old Law, because the Sermon on the Mount contains a lot of reflection on the law of Moses, but it also contains some different material. So first of all, let's talk about how Jesus helps people to interpret properly the law of Moses and teaches them, here is what you ought to be doing if you're following the law. And I was thinking back to Leviticus 19 and verse 2 about how the Israelites were supposed to be holy because God was holy, and then thinking about Matthew 5:48, where Jesus says very similarly, be perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect or complete. And so there's a responsibility to try to be like God. Whether we're talking about the old law or the new law, Jesus' doctrine urges people to be like God. And in this case, he's telling them to obey the law of Moses appropriately. And then also, we know that the golden rule in Matthew 7:12 is a summary of Old Testament ethics. It's also a summary of New Testament ethics, to treat others as you want to be treated in relevant circumstances. So we want to say, I think, that in the big picture, the overall thrust of the Sermon on the Mount is, in one sense, keep the old law properly by doing what Jesus is saying here. Is that on track?
Yeah. No, right. In fact, I didn't know you were handing it off to me.
Oh, my bad. That was unclear.
I was so eager to see where you were going with that.
Well, that was the end, so I was just going to see if you wanted to say anything about it.
No, I was just saying, this is actually the end of Matthew 7 is a great kind of dovetail into next year's study, is it not?
Yes.
Because you have the Old Testament law summarized in the Ten Commandments. That is of course God's ethics, and He's teaching us about His kingdom. He's teaching us about His will. But of course, all of that was designed to point us ultimately to the New Testament and to help us better appreciate the last will and testament of Jesus. And so here's Jesus in his Magna Carta of his ministry, the Sermon on the Mount. He is pointing back at the Old Testament and saying, remember all these things that you learned. Here's why you learned it, and this is for following me.
And all of these people, we need to remember, were still amenable to the law of Moses.
Absolutely.
Because the new covenant had not come. But at the same time, Jesus is in this transitional phase where he is introducing the kingdom of Christ. And so the people walk away from the sermon being amazed at his authority, that he's teaching not like the scribes teach. What do the scribes do? If they're doing their job right, they explain to people how to keep the old law. Jesus is not exactly like that, because not only is he giving an authoritative interpretation of the law of Moses, not relying on the traditional interpretations, but saying, here is my authoritative word on how to interpret this. He's doing that. But then in addition, he's also giving new law that would be part of the covenant of Christ. And I wrote
Right.
down 5 or 6 areas in which Jesus gives new information, not simply saying, here's the appropriate way to consider what the law of Moses says, but here's part of the law of Christ, which is not part of the law of Moses. It's additional law, and it's going to replace the law of Moses. I've got Jesus teaching about the coming of the kingdom of heaven in Matthew 17, 5:17 through 19. Jesus teaching on marriage and divorce in chapter 5, verses 31 and 32. Jesus teaching that we shouldn't make any oath at all in verses 33 through 37. Jesus teaching on not just avoiding retribution, but turning the other cheek in Matthew 5:38 to 42. The model prayer in chapter 6, first part of chapter 6, where God is addressed as Father, unlike in the Old Testament. And then details about the judgment day that are different from anything that the law of Moses had. I mean, it's additional. While Daniel 12 does talk about the judgment day, and Job does talk about meeting his Redeemer at the end of time, there is a greater degree of specificity about what will happen on the judgment day in Matthew 7:22 and 23. And to this we might add, you brought up before the broadcast started that we should add perhaps evangelism in Matthew 5:16 and 17, that there is more of a direct command to be evangelistic than anything that they had in the law of Moses, because Gentiles could be saved without following the law of Moses, whereas in the Christian dispensation, nobody can be saved without following the law of Christ.
Right, right. And by the way, this might be a great time for us to invite our diggers to fact check us on this. If there's something we've missed in the Old Testament that is teaching these principles, let us know. Maybe this isn't so new. But I tend to think that all of these things that Caleb just mentioned, that you just mentioned, that this is new. This is unique to the covenant of Jesus Christ. This is not just reiterating the old law.
And we did not rely on anybody else's list to come up with ours, so we're just studying it for ourselves, and so we hope that you will do the same thing. Okay, Ben, that's all the time we have, really, but why don't I conclude by just asking you to reflect for a moment on the year of study that we've had, and just say, what about the Sermon on the Mount do you appreciate more as a result of having done this study than you did prior to it?
I just have a greater appreciation of the fact that this really is this is the kind of the framework of what Jesus taught. Much like, again, my brain is in next year's study right now, and so maybe that's a good thing. But kind of like how the Ten Commandments, that is kind of the framework for the old law. The Sermon on the Mount is kind of the framework for the new law, and it's just amazing. Every time I go through the Sermon on the Mount, I'm just impressed by how succinct it is, but yet how unlike any other teaching this sermon is. And then, of course, I'm impressed with what Jesus meant when he said in Matthew chapter 5, starting in verse 18, where he talked about, whoever, or verse 19, I should say, rather, whoever relaxes the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same is going to be the least in the kingdom of heaven. Of course, he's saying, he's preaching to people living under the old law, and he's calling people to do a better job following the old law. And if you take the old law seriously, these principles seriously, then you will be set. You will be prepared to live faithfully in the new law and the new dispensation as well. I just think that's kind of impressive.
And I have been blown over by how practical it is, too, that every single section of this, even though he's talking about a lot of Old Testament principles that were written 3,500 years ago, I'm still impressed with the fact that I need to understand these principles to help me be a better person, a better husband, a better father, a better employee, a better friend, a better whatever role I have in life. I need the Sermon on the Mount to help me be what God wants me to be and to have the best life I can. Well, we want to conclude, I guess, by referring people to what you see behind me, which is the advertisement for the next year's study. We're going to be posting the first quarter's worth of material in mere minutes, I suppose. I'll be posting that. Maybe might be a few hours before I do it, but it'll be today where all that will be posted, and then you just launch in to the first month of study. And anything you think we need to tell them about the study for next year, there's an explanatory note at the beginning of the study so that you can, if it's your first time to do Digging Deep, you can learn how to do it. It's not complicated. But is there anything you want to mention to our diggers? You said that the first month is a pretty intense study. I think it may be one of the more rigorous months of study, but that's good.
Yeah, if you can get through the first month, then you can get through any of the months.
Okay. Well, that should be heartening and maybe scary at the same time. But God bless you as you work on this, and we sincerely hope that it's a benefit. And we are at your service. You have our contact information through the Facebook group if you want to get in touch with either one of us to be of any assistance to you as you do the study. And we'll look forward to our September podcast when we'll be talking about the importance of the Ten Commandments in the context of the Old Testament. Well, thank you for a great year of study, Ben, and we really appreciate your efforts to help make this better.
I've enjoyed it. Looking forward to another year.
Okay, thank you for watching. Bye-bye.